Hi, Misha here, and this is one I've been eagerly awaiting the chance to do, because not only to have the new camera, I have a new model, and this is definitely one of my favorite World War II aircraft, possibly my favorite bomber, certainly my favorite American two-engine bomber, the North American Aviation B-25 Mitchell. And in the past, I brought out this model. This is a B-25B from the extremely famous and very historically important Doolittle raid. So it's an early version. In fact, this was the first time the B-25 actually went to combat. And those you can find, but this is a brand new model. This is the B-25J, which is the gunship variant. The Doolittle, of course, is from early 1942, whereas the J is from 1945. The B really started the war, at least offensively, in the Pacific, and the J ended it by escorting the Japanese surrender delegation. Very interesting aircraft with a very colorful history, and while maybe not the most advanced, it had a lot of things going for it. So I figured we'll talk about the history and these two models. Both are 1/72 scale diecast from Corgi, who typically does a good job with their bombers. So with that, with no further ado, let's just get into this history. Let's take this off the stand, put it on the spinny thing. Maybe we can say it did a belly landing. As with most every Corgi, this does come with gear in the up or down position. And you know me, I usually display mine in flight mode. So, the origins. Okay, North American Aviation, NAA, or NA as I'll probably say throughout this video, originally wasn't a big manufacturer, big name in bombers. Their first attempt was the XB-21 around 1926, 1928, in that time period, but this lost out to the Douglas B-18 Bolo, which was adopted. But this did kind of let everyone know, especially in the U.S. Army Air Corps, that, North American was interested in doing bombers. Throughout the early 1930s, not much happened. Of course, some work was done. But in 1938, the Army Air Corps announced a competition for a new attack bomber. And this would be mostly for export, kind of for France, Britain, and maybe anyone else. This would be what we would kind of think of today as a light bomber, or maybe heavy attack aircraft. The general specs were a payload of about 1,200 pounds, a range of about 1,200 miles, and a top speed in excess of 200 miles per hour. And North American, building upon earlier research, submitted a design originally known as the NA-40, but when the first prototype flew in January of 1939, they noticed some issues, so they had to revise it a bit, and this would be the NA-40B, and this would be what they would submit for the competition. But unfortunately for North American, the winner would be Douglas with their D7, later DB7, later A20, known as the Havoc or the Boston, which I've done several videos on. France was also a buyer. Again, this was kind of a light bomber. But just as this competition was wrapping up in March of that same year, 1939, there was another competition, and this time it was for a brand new concept, or at least relatively new, a medium bomber. It would still need a range of about 1,200 miles. This time, though, it would need a top speed of about 300 miles per hour, and its bomb load needed to be about 2,400 pounds, so doubling the bomb load. And it was expected to have a crew of about 5. And of course, it needed to be a twin-engine bomber. Again, the major names in bombing aviation at the time submitted designs. You had Martin, you had Douglas, you had Stearman, and you had North American, who took the NA-40B design, including its tricycle landing gear, updated it to the medium bomber role, and introduced it as the NA-62. And it was a favorite. Basically, it came down to the NA design and the Martin design that summer, but then August, war was very much on the horizon, so they decided to forego the usual process. Typically, they would have an XB model, experimental model, 1 or 2 of these. Then they would have a series of YB models, anywhere from 4 to a dozen, for prototyping, experimenting, pre-production. They're going to skip all that. On September 5, 1939, so just after war opened up in Europe, the U.S. Army Air Corps ordered 184 of the NA-62, giving it the designation B-25. But they had the idea, since they're skipping the prototype stage, to hedge their bets and also order the Martin design, designating it as the B-26. The Martin design was arguably more advanced, but the North American design was cheaper, faster to produce, and more reliable, including its Wright Cyclone engines. So both would go into at least small-scale production. In the first prototype of the B-25, which was actually the first production model, would fly for the very first time on August 19, 1940. This original series, sometimes just called the B-25 or the B-25NA, there would be 24 of. And the first 9 would have a wing with a constant sweep, but then they would discover this caused roll and stability issues, so they would change the wing design after the 9th aircraft to give it a different styling. And this really caused this to fix a lot of the problems. Also, the Army Air Corps wanted a slightly larger fuselage, so the pilot and co-pilot could sit next to each other as opposed to tandem. And they wanted the wing to be lowered a bit. One neat feature, the engines were in nacelles quite low on the wings, which had some benefits. One kind of interesting choice was the split tail design. North American claimed it was to give it a lower profile, but some criticized it for being kind of an older style tail versus some of the new ones, but it worked for the plane. So with that, we're into production. After a little bit of tweaking, we will start to see these delivered to the U.S. Army Air Corps. They took their first 5 in February of 1941. So what exactly do we have here? Well, she is just under 53 feet long, with a wingspan of about 67.5 feet. She's a little slower, at least in combat load, than they were hoping for, at about 270 to 275 miles per hour, although early prototype versions stripped down could get over 300 miles per hour. But to make up for this slight shortcoming, she had a longer range than hoped for, over 1,300 miles, and she had a larger maximum bomb capacity of about 3,000 pounds, although of course at full load, this would be somewhat limited on the range. She originally had a crew of 5, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and she could have a 6th member to operate a rear turret, and this would kind of come and go. A lot of people, because it is a medium bomber, would do several duties. Early on, though, her defensive armament was pretty light. She had one 30 cal machine gun in the nose. She had one 50 cal machine gun in the tail. And she had a 30 cal machine gun in the waist position. I'm not sure if there were 3 30 cals or if it was one 30 cal that could be located in 3 positions. This was not a turret. This was a flexible gun mount. So just kind of something to keep in mind. And again, she did have tricycle landing gear. Very advanced for the day and time. And from the very beginning, she was considered a sweetheart, in the words of many pilots, to fly, take off, and land with. The very opposite of Martin's B-26. In 1941, the B-26 would be given the name Marauder. This was when they started putting names on aircraft. And the B-25 would be christened the Mitchell, which was a very important name. This was the very first U.S. military aircraft to be named after a general, although he was a colonel. William Mitchell, better known as Billy, very colorful figure, and I can make a whole video just on him. Long story short, he served in World War I, was a very early advocate of aviation, had a lot of field experience during the war and afterwards. He was a lieutenant colonel, then he was kind of promoted temporarily to brigadier general. This would go back and forth between colonel and general after the war. Ultimately, he would end his career as nothing. Unfortunately, while he was a visionary for the power of air, after World War I, he was disgusted that the U.S. was backing more and more battleships, dreadnoughts. He saw these as obsolescent and pointed out that the U.S. could build 1,000 bombers for the cost of one dreadnought. And he staged a very public demonstration of his aircraft with Navy assistance, reluctantly, sinking a couple of ships, including an ancient American ship, pre-dreadnought, and a captured Imperial German ship. But the problem is he antagonized the wrong people. And this could have really spelled immediate doom, except he did have public support, popular support in the press, and some in the military still agreed with him, including General MacArthur. Unfortunately, Mitchell also wasn't the most stable person. He was known to drink to excess, and this is by the standards of the 1920s, mind you. And his mental stability wasn't always the best. And this would lead to a divorce. And even in the 1920s, the ex-wife received a lot of leniency. She wasn't shamed. So yeah, he had some issues. Nevertheless, he was a visionary, but unfortunately he criticized too many of the people above him. This led to him being court-martialed beginning in 1925, and then basically retiring from the service in 1926. And unfortunately, he would only live for another 10 years, dying at the age of 56 in 1936. This is unfortunate because he really didn't live to see, he was proven right. The Mitchell bomber here, not to mention the Pearl Harbor raid, and later the Tokyo raid, the Doolittle raid, just showed the poignancy of empire. In fact, as early as like 1922-23, Mitchell recognized that the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor, although he, at that time, didn't really see the validity of aircraft carriers. Again, he's not really big on the Navy. He thought they would launch long-range bombers from land bases. So he got a detail or two wrong, but the general concept was 20 years ahead of its time. So in 1941, the plane was named after him in his honor. And in 1942, he was exonerated by President Roosevelt himself, who at one time was an adversary, later in life would be kind of a frenemy. He was given a Congressional Gold Medal and posthumously promoted to the rank of Major General. which the highest rank he ever held in his life was brigadier. So very interesting character. If you don't know about him, definitely read up on him. So now back to the plane that bears his name. So the earliest version was very lightly armed and armored. They would soon introduce the B-25A. Its major updates would be armor for the crew and self-sealing fuel tanks, which would seem like a no-brainer. But keep in mind, this reduced its overall fuel capacity from over 900 gallons down to under 700. So it definitely decreased its range. But early combat in 1940 and 41 in Europe showed that it was just a necessity, even if they had to make sacrifices. That was about it. They also did update the tail with its 150 cal machine gun, but otherwise left the defensive armament alone. And this was really the next problem. 150 cal and a handful of 30 cal machine guns is not enough to defend a bomber. So the B-25B would be introduced. This would do away with the waist gun arrangement, flexible waist gun, and introduce a top turret with two 50 cal guns, and also a bottom turret that was retractable. It was operated with a periscope, strangely enough. And these would be operated by the radio man, giving him four 50 cal guns. They would actually delete the 150 cal in the rear. So not a bad swap, you know, 1 for 4. And they would make some other updates, including to the engines a bit. But all in all, really the Mitchell's airframe would be pretty unchanged throughout its service life, all things considered. So, if the 50 cal in the back was deleted, why does this model of a B-25B have two guns in the back? Well, it doesn't. This is a Doolittle Raider model. And for that raid, they actually stuck what are called broomsticks. I don't know if they were literally broomsticks or figuratively speaking, in what was the observation blister, to kind of fake Japanese planes into thinking it had two rear guns. That's good because for the Doolittle raid, they stripped these things down, really only leaving the forward 30 cal gun and the top turret for defense. They removed the ventral turret, which was not a popular turret anyway. And they pulled out lots of things like the radio equipment, and they added lots of extra fuel. They increased the fuel on board to over 1,100 gallons. The Doolittle raid would begin training in March of 1942 and would be launched April 18, 1942 against Tokyo, and had 4 other cities in the Honshu province as secondary targets. It would consist of 16 aircraft, originally 15, each carrying roughly 2,000 pounds of bombs, a crew of 5, and it was a one-way mission. And for more on the Doolittle raid, I actually am posting a companion video specifically on that. So otherwise, this whole video here would be consumed by it. So yeah, if you want to go watch my video on the Doolittle raid, I'll wait here. Well, pause me. Yep. One reason I took this off the stand, the Corgis use kind of a rubber gasket, which is great for moving, but after a while it gets a little weak. Need to glue that. Otherwise, nice stand. These are rubber coated, not to mar your plane. Metal, plastic base. On their heavier models, they even give you a metal base. Very heavy stand too. Just got to watch out for those rubber gaskets. Alright, you back from the Doolittle? Alright. So that's the B-25B and the specific variant used by the Doolittle Raiders. Really the only thing, because they only built 120 B-25Bs. So between the original and the A and the B, they fulfilled the initial contract for 184. And subsequent contracts would be given, of course, because it was already proving itself. The last B would roll off the production line in January and would be accepted by the Air Corps in May of 1942. But already, by late 1941, they're working on an improved model. In fact, the prototype of what will become the B-25C would fly in November of 1941, so just before the war, and would go into production after the B in 42. Essentially, it had uprated engines, still the same Wright cyclone engines, just a new version from Dash 9 to Dash 13. The C would also be the first to have de-icing and anti-icing equipment standard. The Doolittle Raiders did have some installed, but this would become standard equipment. And they would start to try to figure out how to make this ventral turret work right, though they never really succeeded. It's not on this model because it wouldn't be on the Doolittle Raider, but if it were here, show you, it would be about here, and it was retractable. Unfortunately, even retractable, it introduced drag along with the top turret. They thought about reintroducing a rear turret, but they didn't really have space. They only had room for that 150 cal in the back. So they weren't sure what to do, but it was in the back of their minds that needed to be fixed. The B-25C would be the first wartime full production model. The A was the first combat-capable model, although it seems like all the originals and A's never left America. They were just used for training and maybe coastal patrol right after the war began, but the B was the first to really see use, and the C was the first full production. They would build over 1,600 of the C's, and then the D would come online. And the difference between the C and the D, at least initially, was simply that the C was produced at North American Aviation's original plant in California, and the D was produced at their new plant in Kansas. And once this plant came online, it would start to dominate Mitchell production. Alright, where was I? Cameras. Anyway, the Kansas factory would start up production and would actually build nearly 2,300 D models. This allowed North American and California to focus more on their P-51 Mustang, and they were still building the T-6 Texan, the Harvard as well. Actually, they produced more aircraft and great variety during the war than anyone else. So, the first ones sent to the UK were a few of the early models known as the, about 2 dozen of them, known as the Mitchell Mark I. Then they would send more of the C's and D's known as the Mitchell Mark II. Also, 5 U.S. Air Corps bombardment groups would operate the Mitchell. Starting off, they were just in time in October of 1942 for the Second Battle of El Alamein and to support Operation Torch, the North African campaign landings. Then they would be used for coastal patrol, anti-shipping. They would be there for the invasion of Sicily and then working their way up through Italy. They would even be flown over Austria and over the Balkans because the B-25 had more range than either the A-20 or its replacement, the A-26 from Douglas. However, the U.S. would never fly the Mitchell out of the UK, so never over Germany. But the English would use it. They would get it over around 900 which allowed them to replace older, worn-out planes, including the A-20. And a few other air forces would fly it besides. So it did have an impact in the North African and the Southern European campaign, even anti-shipping roles. But it was really the Pacific that brought the Mitchell into its own, and really where it earned its keep. After the Doolittle raid, it was used over Burma. It was used throughout all the island hopping campaigns, New Guinea. It was flown by the Australians, New Zealand, and of course the U.S. Army Air Corps. But not just the Air Corps. In fact, this was one of the few aircraft to be flown by all branches. The U.S. Navy adopted it in 1942 as the PBJ-1. And most of these were actually flown by Marine aviators, U.S. Marine Corps aviators. And they would use them for anti-submarine patrols, often putting radar sets in them. They were big enough for that. They would use skip bombing to try to smack the side of a Japanese ship with a 500-pound bomb. They even worked on a variant that could carry a single torpedo shackled on the outside under the belly. Well, kind of in the belly, you know what I mean. Yeah, anyway. From there, it really would prove a very sturdy design. Of course, it was never flown from carriers again, because that was crazy. But it flew from land bases. Heck, even the U.S. Coast Guard flew some B-25s to try to protect, well, the coast from ships and submarines. So yeah, all branches did operate it. But this was designed as a medium altitude medium bomber, complete with the Norden bomb sight. Unfortunately, the Pacific, unlike Europe, really wasn't well suited for medium altitude bombing. Depending on the variant, the Mitchell had a max altitude of between 23 and 25,000 feet, so, But the heavy jungle canopies and other foliage and just the terrain and the islands and the way that the Japanese had more small cottage industry, they needed to get low. Low-level bombing became the order of the day. And that's when the C's and the D's really weren't the best thing, and we get our later war generation Mitchells. Before that, I want to show you one neat feature of this Corgi model, one that they do on some of their bombers if there's physically room to do it. We have hinged bays. We have a bomb inside, and the doors actually open and close. The hinges are well concealed. As you see, they close up very evenly, and they're actually made of metal, not plastic. They aren't able to do this with all of their bombers, depending on the hull design, fuselage, but when they can, they do. We also have, of course, a rotating turret here with the movable machine guns. Obviously, these don't really move aside from just moving around, because they didn't really do much in real life. And the propellers move quite evenly. And we have crew figures inside, although they're not removable. And this is all metal except for the glass part. The wing is metal. It's metal. Part of the nacelle is metal. The front is plastic where the detailing is. And the tail is partially plastic. But everything else is metal. So it's actually a pretty chunky plane. But yeah, let's set the good old Doolittle B aside and now focus on the just released B-25J. Don't worry about the guns pointing at you. They're unloaded, I think. The B-25J. Well, let's back up a bit, of course, to see how we get from the CDs to the J. As early as 1942, work was underway at North American for a gunship version, originally thought to be good for anti-shipping, which it, yeah. And this would be put into production as the B-25G, basically the summer of 1943. Now, North American and California would end C production around the same time, whereas North American and Kansas would continue D production through March of 1944, although in a modified form. The G was a very interesting critter. One thing that they did late in C and D production, first they upgraded the 30 cal flexible gun on the nose to a 50 cal, then they added a second fixed 50 cal gun. While with the G, they added 2 more 50 caliber guns for a total of 4 in the nose. And they added a 75 millimeter cannon, literally from an M4 Sherman tank. Because why not? And the idea was they could use this to shoot the sides of Japanese shipping. Didn't really work out that well in practice, but that was the idea. They also improved the fuel capacity. By this point, they could carry additional tanks in the bomb bay. And they were finally doing away with the ventral turret, the retractable one that never worked well with the periscope. They started introducing a true rear turret with 2 50 cal machine guns, so they had to kind of increase the rear here a bit to make room for the guns and the man in them. And while this version, the G, was well suited for strafing and ground attacks, it was weak on defense. Again, kind of the same early problem. Therefore, they would only build about 400 of them and convert 60 or 70 more from older models. This would come into the J model. Excuse me, the H model. Let's not skip ahead too much. The H had several improvements, especially to defense. It moved the top turret from back here to up here, so it could be fixed ahead to work with the nose guns or still be used as a turret. And then they would install 2 50 cal waist guns, one on each side. They're not turrets, but they are flexible. These would be operated by the radio man. This turret would be operated by the navigator. So now we're starting to get decent defense again against aircraft. Also, that M4 cannon. It was big and heavy. So they went to a new model, the T-13 lightweight cannon, more or less specifically designed for the Mitchell. And the H model would be more successful, with about 1,000 built in California. And of these, over 300 would be sent to the UK, where they, along with later gunship models, would be known as the Mitchell Mark III. They would also be used a little bit in Russia. And these were used for tactical striking of targets, bridges, communications lines, blah, 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 pinpoint shooting. They would usually even remove the Norden bomb site, which was pretty useless at low altitude, and instead they'd make room for more guns. And they would add more guns. They would have the 4 on the nose. They would also install gun packs on the fuselage, all kinds of gun configurations, taking these in, taking these out. But with the H model being in widespread use compared to the G, some crews removed the cannon altogether. it wasn't all that practical. Maybe awesome to see a 75mm cannon on an aircraft, but it was 9 foot long. Its shells were 26 inches, weighed about 20 pounds each, and they could only carry about 21 shells per plane, and they had to be manually loaded and reloaded by the navigator, and they were fired by the pilot. So crews started removing the cannons and just putting more 50 cal Brownings instead. And this was perfectly fine going to the solid nose, because North American had kind of designed the Mitchell to be modular, at least by the standards of the 1940s, so swapping noses was not a huge deal and could be done in the field. The H model would be the last one produced in California. In Kansas, they would go from the late D model to the J model here. Now, late D models, sometimes known as the B-25D2, would get more guns and kind of become more like this. When Kansas switched over to a gunship model, it wasn't maybe a full gunship. In fact, it was kind of a bomber still. The J was the most produced version, with over 4,300 built. And many left the factory with the glass nose of a bomber, but not all. Some did come with the solid nose featuring 8 machine guns. But if you notice this one, 4 machine guns. If you notice this one has 8. That's because many of these had the bomb nose replaced in the field with machine guns. Meaning they had a lot. In fact, some versions of the Mitchell towards the end had as many as 18 Brownings and was able to point 10, 12 forward, and then having 4 kind of facing rear. So these were becoming very effective ground strafers. They also started to be fitted around 1944 with up to 8 5-inch rockets on little rails on the wings, which were great for anti-shipping and hitting ground targets. But they didn't forego the bombing ability either. Basically, they still carried bombs. In fact, now they could carry up to 3,000-pound bombs in the bay, so they would soften up a target with their guns and or rockets, and if needs be, drop bombs on it. On the other hand, if bombs weren't as called for, they could install auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay to further increase the range and endurance. So this really did start to evolve into a gunship that could be customized however they wanted. So while Mitchell production would end in 1944 in California, it would continue throughout the war and slightly afterwards in Kansas. Very interesting ship. Lots of guns. While some in the Army Air Corps, later named the U.S. Army Air Forces, would get away from the B-25 Mitchell in favor of newer aircraft, including the B-26 or the A-26, separate planes, or of course B-29s taking over. Many others would fly them, especially the Marines, through the end of the war. In fact, I believe it was 4 B-25Js were assigned to escort a very special G-4M Betty Japanese bomber in August of 1945. They were carrying the Japanese peace or surrender delegation along with the official terms of the end of the war. So very good position. Again, they kind of started the offensive war, at least in the air, against Japan in April of 1942, and they effectively closed the war out in August of 1945. All told, over 9,800 Mitchells were produced, more than any other Allied twin-engine bomber. and of these, over 6,600 came from Kansas. But again, this left California free to focus on the very successful P-51 Mustang. And like the P-51, the Mitchell's career would continue after the war, and even into the time of the independent U.S. Air Force. They were used for a time, but then in 1952, the ones left were transformed into twin-engine trainers, known as the TB-25L. They were also used extensively during the war and after the war as transports for high-ranking officers. Even after the war, they were sometimes purchased by private companies and used as executive transports. Why not? So many were flying for a very long time. In fact, some are still airworthy to this very day, but are in the hands of collectors. The Mitchell's final mission for the U.S. Air Force came on May 21st, 1960. That was its final flight, and afterwards it was officially retired during a ceremony. So there you have a sort of brief history of the B-25 Mitchell. And again, if you'd like to know about the Doolittle raid, or at least my take on it, check out that video too. Very neat plane, and Corgi does a great job. They're not the only ones to make this in 1/72 scale diecast. You have Air Force One, and you had Forces of Valor, and other makers like Thomas Gunn do it in 1/48, but that's not what I collect. I don't know anything about the Forces of Valor, never owned one, although I do own one of their B-26 Marauders. The Air Force One isn't bad. It is less expensive, but it has gear in the down position only. I don't believe it has the hinged bomb bay. It has rotating turret, but not moving guns. And many have said that the paint scheme is less than perfect, although they're not a bad effort. But Corgi really does do well with their World War II bombers, and this seems to be no exception. Everything here, and I was really happy that they relocated the turret. You can see how much further forward it is on this J model versus the B. And I like that they took the time to put the fake guns in the tail. The opening bomb bays are neat, spinning propeller. The only minor flaw, one of my 250 cal guns came in a little bit crooked, a little bit bent. Not from damage, just, because they are plastic and just the way it came out of the mold. But it's not bad. Not bad at all. Everything else is very straight and even on these. Including the front guns. And again, they're very weighty, very metal. So I wanted to do a fitting tribute to one of my favorite planes. And I had this new J to talk about, so why not? A B and a J. Kind of a good roundabout. Maybe it would be neat to have a G or an H with the cannon, but again, the J was the most produced version and saw so much use in 1944 and 45 that, why not? Well, I'll probably start revisiting some of the bombers. I haven't done that in a while, especially with the new camera. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you own any of these, from any of the brands, let's talk about them in the comments below. With that, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.